Skeuomorphism.
See, do I pronounce the O or skeuomorphism? You've probably heard of it. People probably talk about it a bit more these days because there's a lot of nostalgia for the way the iPhone used to look and the way Windows used to look, etc. So if you don't know, skeuomorphism is a sort of design language in which everything looks physical and tangible, and stuff that you can click on looks like a thing that you could press down on in real life. So this can be very literal sometimes, like the calculator on the old iPhone, it looks like a real calculator. But then you also have Windows XP, where there's some dimensionality to it. Another good example of this is like all the old logos that you used to have on the apps. You know, the apps that we do. You know when you do the apps. Instagram looked like this. YouTube looked like this. You get the idea. So skeuomorphism was kind of the predominant style of like user interfaces and things of that nature in like the early aughts, probably up to like, I don't know, when did Windows 8 come out? Earlier, there was a lot of people who didn't know how to use a smartphone, didn't know how to use a computer. Having the YouTube app look like a TV kind of tells you, okay, this is the app where I watch stuff. And having the Instagram app look like a Polaroid camera makes you go, oh yeah, that's that hip new photo sharing app. So I think you get the idea. I think that skeuomorphism has been enjoying a little bit of a wave of popularity lately. I feel like people are missing that kind of design. And you can see this move away from skeuomorphism everywhere. To show you like a basic example of this, let's look at like the biggest video game franchise ever. Let's look at Mario. He's my friend. Look at him. There he is. Okay, now let's look at the games. Look at Mario Sunshine, right? Look at the menus, look at your life counter and things like that. Mario Odyssey, look at the life counter here. Compare the two, compare and contrast. Let me know what's different. Let me know in the comments right now how they're different. I'll give you some time. That's a silly thing to do, isn't it? Obviously they're different. Your life counter isn't a real thing that you have in real life, so there's no one way to do this. But when you look at the life counter in the older Mario game, it looks like you can reach out and touch it. Even Zelda, the hearts in the old ones, they look like tangible little props. Almost like you can hold one of them and you got a little heart in your hand. In the newer ones, it's just a flat image of a heart. So it's more like if you grabbed and touched it, you get a paper cut, and that's no good. So what I'm saying is skeuomorphism needs to come back so that we don't get paper cuts when we play video games. I do think it's interesting to see that sort of shift away from skeuomorphism. I think part of it is that we've all become a lot more tech savvy. The average person knows how to use a computer. The average person knows how to use a smartphone, an iPad. So people don't need as much guidance. They don't need that sort of visual signposting of this thing is clickable and that's why it looks physical. On top of that, I also just think it's seen as a bit tacky when your interface doesn't have that flatter, more modern style. Design trends come and go, and skeuomorphism just kind of went out of fashion. So why do I bring all of this up? Well, I think skeuomorphism is coming back. And it's not necessarily on most flat screen games, but I have noticed in VR, that is virtual reality, a thing that exists now, you'll notice that most menu elements and things like that are tangible in some way, most of the time. And that makes sense because in VR, it's all about being in the game. It surrounds you. You feel like you're there. So it stands to reason that if you want to press a button that does something in the menu, it's a good idea to make that a real button that you can physically press with your hand. That's cool. And that makes sense, it's intuitive. And I think it's interesting that skeuomorphism is kind of coming back. There's this whole new medium almost that has yet to undergo that sort of shift away from skeuomorphism. And I do think maybe it might happen at some point. And I think there are a lot of VR games that don't have skeuomorphism, or that have less of it, or have a lot of menu elements that look like 2D flat screen menu elements just sort of in a 3D space that you just sort of point and click at using your controller as a pointer. I think that's a good way to navigate some menus. I think it's very functional, but I definitely think that there's something very special about a button that looks like a button. A little toggle switch that looks like an actual switch. That's good, that's cool. And something I've noticed as well is just in general, I've noticed that VR games are comparable to the video games that like my generation grew up with in kind of a lot of ways. A big part of it is that most VR games these days are built with the Oculus Quest in mind. Now, what this means is that a lot of VR games have to make compromises. So because they run on less powerful hardware, that means you get games that are built to be easier to run, which means smaller levels, less realistic graphics. What you end up getting is a lot of people kind of still trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And so there's a lot of risk taking. And I think that sort of brings out a lot of really fun, creative ideas that in a way feels very, very similar to when video game systems were only just getting powerful enough to do like really cool shit. And when you look at video games today, a lot of the games that come out these days are very similar in a lot of ways, and they rely on a lot of tropes that I don't love. They use these tropes because they appeal to a very wide demographic. It's just sort of, let's see what we can do that'll appeal to the most amount of people possible. VR is still a bit niche, so there's not as much of a sense of we need to make a game that everyone will play or everyone will put money into in some way. And I find when a developer is more likely to take risks, I feel like they're also more likely to make a good game. I think the best games are games that do something novel or unique, or something that isn't maybe as unique, but do it really, really well. You play it and you're like, yes, there was a lot of thought, a lot of effort, there was a lot of time spent making this game good. A lot of passion went into this. And that kind of thing is sort of, in my view, getting rarer and rarer. By the way, indie games, great. So much variety, so much creativity. I think it's awesome that games are easier to make than ever, so that we get a lot more personal feeling games, which is good. That's good for art, obviously. But speaking strictly on the AAA side of things, the games that have massive amounts of money poured into them, you could use that money for like greatness. You could make amazing games, and sometimes they do. But most of the time it's very derivative, very usually polished enough, but just a little bit on the who cares side of things, you know? A bit of a, I'll play this game once and probably never think about it again kind of thing. Now, on the VR side of things, you have a lot of major publishers putting their IPs on there now. Because VR, it's not quite as niche as it once was. I would say it's still niche, but it's getting a bit more popular these days. And so there's more money to be made in it, and so there's more money being put into the games. And those games you'd think would generally have a little bit less risk put into them, so therefore a little bit less creativity. But the thing is, almost anything you do when you make a VR game is very risky, because VR is just sort of a bit uncharted. So when every creative choice is a risk in some way, just by virtue of VR being very young as an art form, I feel like there's more sort of diversity in the ways that developers handle certain things. Like menus, huh? I brought it back. But it's not just the menus, but look at the menus. Look at the menus. It's so fun. It's so good. But it's not just the menus. It's just a sort of willingness to just sort of throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. You end up with a lot of unique ways of moving the player character around, a lot of different ways to jump, to shoot a gun, to reload a gun. Most 2D games in which you can reload have you just press a button to do that. You press a button and you reload. In VR, it's like, how much control over the reload do you give the player? Do you make them do the whole thing, where they, the thing slides out of the thing and the thing, or do you just sort of do a little motion, like a little slide, maybe? Little slide, and then it's done. Maybe you make it a bit more arcadey. Maybe you shoot the ceiling or the floor to reload. In some VR games, to jump, you press a button. In other VR games, to jump, you swing your arms up. That's nuts. I played a VR game where in order to move around, you create little portals for yourself. You shoot a gun and he shoots a portal. It's almost like a portal gun. I don't know that it always makes it more immersive necessarily, but it definitely gives the act of moving some character. And so you have these different ways of doing things in VR games, and it starts to become pretty clear that the best ways of doing things is the most intuitive way, which is, in a lot of instances, skeuomorphism. So there's a menu and it's just a panel that's in front of you and there's buttons on it and you can press the buttons to do things in the menu. Or there's a hologram in front of you and a little laser pointer. And that's not necessarily skeuomorphism, I guess, but it still feels a little grounded in the game's universe. It feels like you're looking at a futuristic hologram. So when you see all these VR games using that kind of design language, it sort of starts to become clear to me, at least, that a lot of things that aren't VR games could do with a little callback to a simpler time when things looked like things. I think movie logos should look like really expensive blocks of gold shaped into a word, you know? Like you could touch that logo and you stroke the logo, and it's so cold and smooth. So what's my point? My point is that skeuomorphism is a thing that I just talked about along with a bunch of other things also. And you listened. You fool, you listened to me the whole time.
I deceived you into listening to me talk about my interests.
But thanks for that anyways. Hope you'll be a good sport about it and give me a like and maybe comment something about how much you liked the video and say very nice, lovely things about me in the comments. Thank you and goodbye. I just realized I had this light the whole time. I forgot to turn it on. So like this is what it would have looked like if I had done that.